It was September. Two people sat on the roof of a building and looked at the city, which was in full view, a boy and a girl. Yasia looked at Vijin, resting her cheek on her palm, asking about his dream. The boy held ice cream in his hand. He licked it. His dream was to build the most beautiful house. Looking into the distance, the girl thought. The dream was similar to the dream of her father. Looking up from the ice cream, Vijin beamed. He envied the girl and wanted to be like her father. A man approached them. He heard their conversation. He was interested in what was wrong with this place. It was the girl's father, Hunter. He smiled, looked at the children, they screamed. He sat down in the middle with them, his legs hanging down. He arrived in a car that was parked behind. I looked down. He smiled sadly, and turning to the boy, he replied that he envied him because he had not dreamed for a long time. Embarrassed, Hunter boasted that he had once designed a 30-story building, and the boy approached him. Hunching over, he admitted that it wasn't as fun as he'd imagined. In the place where they live, it is impossible to build anything else, only one square. Leaning towards Viggen, Hunter admitted that he had not been abroad, but was sure that everything was possible there. The girl touched the backpack. There was a smile on her face. She turned to her father so as not to clutter the child's head. The man and girl stood up. They said goodbye to the boy and were about to leave. Hunter turned to Viggen so that he would not lose his dream even after time. The boy was embarrassed. He promised that he would build something beautiful. And after these words, he turned to the girl, combed his head with his hand, and announced that he would marry her. The words flowed like a river. If he did not forget his dream, then Hunter would give him a gift. A grown man, 42 years old, looks at the plan in his hands. This is Vijin, looking up from the sheet, shouting to the side that the tile laying was finished. He thought that if he left everything like this, then they would have a problem later. A man approached him. The head of the company, Kai Kirsch, arrived to them. He specialized in architectural design in Spain. Vijin bowed his head in greeting, but he passed by, throwing a note in his direction about checking things out. The guy looked over his shoulder at the manager and thought that the meeting with the customer had gone poorly. The boss found something to be biased about. He touched the tiles and confidently declared that they were dirty. Kai was interested in the deadlines. He hoped that everything would be completed on time. He pointed to the hydrant. He didn't do that in the plan. It's striking. Vijin smiled. For safety reasons, they decided that he would be hidden like this. Kai poked his finger into the guy's chest, asking him if he knew anything about design. The chief accepted his position, but it still needs to be done as planned. Vigin's face darkened. After saying that he was just a builder and obeyed orders, he turned pale. Hanging his head, he remembered various situations with subordinates where there was no money for the education of their children. The hand clenched with great force the fist that contained the construction plan. Completion of construction. The man met the manager and assured that everything would be fine. The fire hydrant was hidden in the slab. Everything was done as planned. The fire engulfed the building. People were running around and did not understand what to do. They ran in search of a hydrant, but never found it. The girl was holding a handkerchief near her mouth. She was choking and asking for help. The two were in the office, sitting on the sofa. They were sad. Not a single smile on their faces. The man closed his eyes. He was clutching his elbow. He was nervous. The client was angry. Vijin, and it was he, confirmed his words. He warned that in a dangerous situation, the necessary things should be open. The man grinned, tucking his chin in his hand, wondering what the guy was complaining about. Vijin jumped up from his seat. He screamed. He did not agree with this. The man smiled, he joked. But the guy roared even more. People's lives are not a joke. Looking at another man nearby, how he takes out some documents from a folder. Vijin made excuses, saying that on the last day, the boss controlled everything. They pushed a sheet of paper towards him. This is a plan, and asked him to look at the date of this plan. His face darkened. Something was bothering him. Something was incomprehensible to him. He suspected something. Having looked directly, the man offered to pay a reasonable price and pretend that it was the boss who made the wrong drawing. But Vigin doubted. He didn't want to agree if he didn't agree. He wanted to hear what would happen. Sitting on a chair, the man smiled, folding his hands on his knees, because the money for the construction had not yet been paid. Sweat rolled down Vigen's forehead. He couldn't afford not to pay them. Smiling, the man pretended that it had nothing to do with it, and that he had done something wrong. Hearing that the father of the man sitting in front was the president of the company, he completely dropped. The man straightened his tie, looked to the side. A smile played on his face. He wanted to seem modest. It won't be difficult for him to bury Wigen's company. He jumped up, but was stopped by another guy. Taking a glass of coffee and grinning into it, he annoyed the guy by saying that he hangs out with uneducated people, which is why he's still at a construction site. Wigen was angry. He screamed. The man calmed him down, urging him to calm down, since aggression will not solve anything. The calming man said that he had better agree to the proposal. Looking at him, his face turned black. Vigen reached his hand to his mouth. A young man was sitting on a bench next to a large banner advertising a girl, glowing and cheerful. Looking with a heavy, tired look, Vigen said the girl's name Yasia. Throwing his head back so that he hit the back of his head, the hero closed his eye. There was a bright light, and through this light a bus drove forward, spreading this light to both sides. The young man entered the open doors of the bus and climbed the steps. He sat down on an empty seat in the cabin. The bag strap rolled off his shoulder, resting his head on his hand. He was lost in his thoughts that he wanted to become a designer and build beautiful houses. He looked out the window, dismissing his dream he could barely make ends meet. A voice called out to him. The voice asked if he had forgotten about his dream. He saw Hunter. He was sitting and smiling, closing his eyes, but through the cracks he was spying on the guy. Turning to him, he clenches his teeth, not understanding how this could happen. But Hunter is already going down the stairs from the bus. The guy only sees the back. Wigen jumps out after his uncle, tries to catch up with him, calls out to him. He looks around and realizes that they came out in the very place where he dreamed as a boy. The guy sees a man with gray hair going up the stairs. Vigen is immersed in his thoughts. He decided to move on. He will do everything for this. He was able to catch up with the man, approached a familiar house, but stood and watched as the old man opened the door. It was a long time ago. He sincerely did not understand why this man came here. Distracted by his thoughts, Vigen missed the moment when Hunter disappeared somewhere. He grabbed the door, intending to enter because he had come so far, and now there was no point in turning back. The guy persuaded himself he just wants to refresh his memories. He needs it. Opening the door and going inside, Vigen thought that this was an ordinary house that stood alone. He turned on the light on his phone and continued to tell himself about this house. The designer rooms. Looking into the room, shining a flashlight from the phone. An incredible place for a house that was built a long time ago. The phone fell from his hands with a thud on the floor, the sound resounding in the silence of the house. He looked straight, could only utter one word and breathed out this word incredibly. He was surprised that everything was the same as before. All the furniture, all the objects, everything was the same as before when he was little. Lowering his head down, he saw the imprint of a shoe. Moving away from it, he exclaimed. Hearing the voice, Vigen sharply turned his head towards where the voice came from. Hunter stood in front of him, shining, smiling, and praised the guy for not giving up his dream. It was as if he had not changed during this time. He smiled, holding out his hand to Vigen, and the portal glowed behind him. The guy opened his mouth. He didn't know how to react, didn't understand what was happening at all, couldn't utter a word. Hunter was floating. He beckoned the man to come to him, pointing at something with his hand, saying that it would allow him to see his dream. The guy leaned forward. He didn't understand what his uncle wanted and meant. Grabbing his head sharply with his hand, Vigen screamed. His eyes were closed, and his face was distorted with a grimace of pain. Sweat was dripping down his face. He didn't understand where he was. He looked lost. Looking down at his hands, he was still in the dark about where he ended up. Looking carefully around, he saw cabinets and uniforms. He was surprised, since he was in the company. Sweat was dripping down. His teeth were clenched. His eyes were wide open. He was in shock and didn't understand what was happening anyway. The guy woke up. rubbed his eyes, saw Vegan, and called him by his last name, adding the word sergeant. He looked at the fighter incomprehensibly. He was asked to change his clothes. Turning his head, he saw something that made him scream. Vegan returned that day when his service came to an end. He screamed. His mouth opened. Now he was already out of the gate in uniform, the last day of his service. He stood confused. Taking off his cap, he turned back, wondering because if he had gone back 10 years ago, his life would have gone completely differently. Looking at the phone in his hand, he could not save it. He regretted it. Vegan went into the store. He wanted to buy a new phone. He was given a choice. The seller looked at him, probed him, considered him a weakling. The guy asked for the latest model of phone. 3 phones from different companies were laid out in front of him. The seller insisted on a certain model because he wanted to get a profit. After looking, Vegan asked for some more models or to repair his own. But the seller began to dissuade us from repairs and assured us of the need to buy a new one. The seller smiled and calculated its cost. But the guy said goodbye and opened the exit door. The seller shouted in his back that they wouldn't buy anything else at that price anywhere else. Looking at the phone, it started working. The soldier was surprised. He thought it was a joke. Vegan is sitting on the bus. He reached into his backpack. He began to look for something inside. Finding his headphones, he prepared to listen to music. It had been 10 years since he had listened to music. Leaning against the window, he plunged into the world of news, music, and rode the bus. Entering the room, taking off his uniform as he went, he looked around. He fell onto the bed, spreading his arms to the sides. He was resting. He had not been at home for so long, but how good he felt. He succumbed to memories. The guy could explain the reasons for his failure in the past. He felt sorry for his mother, his academic education, so he chose to go to the architect's office instead of design. Putting his hand under his head, he decided that everything would be different. He was sure of it. His mother came into the house. She put her hand to her chest and exclaimed that her son had returned. The hero's eyes sparkled with tears. He looked at his mother. Everything that was happening seemed like a dream to him. Putting his hand to his head, he saluted his mother and shouted loudly that he had returned home. The service was over. She praised him. After that, he squeezed her tightly in his arms. She was surprised at such impulses from him. Hugging his mother with both hands, he promised himself that he would be a good son in this life. The hero was watching TV and cheering for the team. 2 weeks later, his mother came out to him, surprised by his screams. While eating dumplings, he listened to his mother. When he heard the word study, he was very surprised. She confirmed her words and advised me to buy some clothes. Smiling at his mother, he agreed to go out to get some air when he noticed the woman's fear that he was sitting at home. Putting his fork on the plate, the guy convinced him that he had already rested enough. Looking at the ticket in his hand, he thought about the need to wait. Otherwise, it would be revealed. Sitting on a chair, his hand in his pocket, he looked at the phone. Did not know how and then how to do it. Grinning, the guy thought that this was a picture, and it was ridiculous. His eyes looked straight. Bowing his head, resting his hand, he did not understand what was wonderful at this time. He had to return to 16. Turning on the camera on his phone, he smiled and said that he came from 2030. But noticing the girls who paid attention to him, he became embarrassed and pretended that he was not filming himself. Cupping his face in his hand, Vegan lamented that time was passing slowly. Rising sharply from the chair, putting his hands on the table, the guy realized that he would not waste such a chance. He would fix everything. The girls looked at each other. Vegan ran. He was sweating, but he continued to move forward. There was determination in his eyes to fix everything. Out of breath, he stopped, put his hands on his knees, and tried to catch his breath. Straightening up, he looked at the old building without taking his eyes off it. In front of him there was a building, and he saw that from his time, a house that was being sold for a lot of money. The guy thought that if they had not sold this house as collateral, their living conditions would have been much better. 2 years later, his mother sells the house last time, but this time he will not allow his mother to do it. Vegan looked at the phone in his hand. The job advertisement will be posted tomorrow. He will earn some money tomorrow. Took his eyes off the phone and looked somewhere to the side. People were sitting in the room waiting for something. One man stood with his chin in his hand. He shouted at the men. They did not provide labor. He wondered what they were doing. Standing in front of the men, he began shouting about the deadlines and how difficult it would be for them to complete the construction. Hearing that they had already called the HR department, he raised his hands and began to shake them. Turning away from them, he looked halfway at them. He would decide something. They thanked him. He only needs 3 people, only 3 who can do the interior work. Looking in the other direction, he gave the order to start from Sector B, where there was a cafe. The subordinate hesitated. He was afraid that the design would have to be ready in a few days. Looking out the window, he offers to pay more, but in exchange he wants to see a beautiful design. Viggen was going up the stairs. The worker was going down, muttering about his problem of finding the right person. The guy heard him. He smiled at his thoughts, thinking that he knew all this and that it was expected. Getting up, he opened the door, walked in and said hello. Continuing to smile, he stood waiting. The man was distracted from his work. He looked at the guy and asked him what he needed here. Viggen approached him. He replied that if it was for work, then not to him, but to the Labor Bureau. The young man showed a sheet of paper, a job advertisement. The smile did not leave his face. Pointing to himself, the guy said that they needed someone who would draw pictures, and he had experience. Looking at it, he became curious about how he saw this advertisement in 2 hours. The man smiled. He found out how old Viggen was and thought that he was joking with him. But when I heard that the guy worked under Carewise, he leaned forward. Viggen offered to check him. He needed a day. Even without payment, they would check him. The boss remembered Care. He is an outstanding designer. Good work. He himself was with him once. The young man didn't lie. He really worked with him for 5 years in a previous life and learned a lot. Naturally, there is no way to check the words, since he is abroad now. The man looked at the guy. What was he offering? Weejian suggested doing his job. Well, that's obvious. They shook hands, believing each other's words. One needed people. The other was not trying to deceive. I was distracted by the phone and asked the young man to wait for a few minutes. The boss laughed. This was an important call. Opening the door, he offered the guy a choice of coffee or tea. He chose coffee. They walked to the work table. The boss did not delay and immediately offered to get to work, since they were in a hurry with the change. Peter Wong was surprised when the guy called him by name and looked at him for a long time. Viggen smiled, raised his hand behind his head. He couldn't restrain himself and ended up calling him manager. But the man had already begun to think when he managed to tell him his full name. A little later, Peter tried to contact Cyrus, but he was away, so he couldn't. He thought about the guy, how he looked like he and the man were friends. He had nothing to lose anyway. Viggen sat at his desk and wondered if he would be able to show off his skill. Turning around, he asked someone about the sketches, the plan to check with a click of the mouse. The question was directed to the manager, who was hovering over the guy. He had several drawings, but they were ordinary. A drop of sweat ran down the man's cheek. He turned away, throwing it away as usual. He was not going to make excuses. Having unfolded the body, Viggen directly asked if he could make a model. Peter was surprised that he volunteered to make the model himself. There will be no payment for modeling, but this was not a problem. There will still be daily payments. Raising his head, the man began to talk about tomorrow morning. Viggen interrupted, saying that he needed less time. He knew what he was saying. Peter's face changed. He was amazed at such efficiency. Staring at his work computer, in front of him was a modeling program. The guy was excited. The boss turned to him, asking whether everything was in order and whether there would be any problems. But Viggen remained calm. He had not used this program for a long time, but now he would remember it. Peter leaned his body towards him, folded his hands on his chest. It was not clear to him what he had been using for a long time. But the young man interrupted him and began to work. His hand is on the computer mouse. He is focused and knows what he is doing. His fingers pressed, barely touching the key, typing and selecting options. Time passed, and the model of the building was ready. It showed off on the screen. Peter raised his eyebrows, opened his eyes, raised his hand to his mouth. He was shocked. Smiling, clarifying the working details with the man, he put on his jacket and headed for the exit. Peter followed Widgeon with his eyes and thought that his skills as a carpenter would come in handy. The guy smiled, was pleased, he was needed, and he would help. He was called as a carpenter. The next day, Viggen was working on the ceiling. He used the device. He worked and pulled a heavy cart. He made an effort, but he smiled. He liked everything. The man approached the boss. He was surprised that work was going on below. The chief turned around, saw Jan, smiled, and confirmed the guy's guess. But the guy was confused. He put his hand to the back of his head. How did he manage to find a specialist? Because everyone was busy. Peter folded his arms and turned away. He has his own methods. It's not for nothing that he's a manager. At this time, Viggen wondered why there were only 3 people here, holding a plan in his hands. Those 2 began to discuss him, believing that he was a kid. And if something happened to him, who would be responsible? Peter turned sharply to the speaker and asked him to take his words back. But Jan tried to understand why this was so. He brought his face closer to the boss, trying to find out the secret. Closing his eyes, the boss ordered them to count on him, adding that he could become their savior. Viggen looked at the workers and gave commands on where to do what and how to do it. I conveyed the manager's words that the work would only end when a certain quota was reached. The man looked at his watch. If they continue at the same pace, they will finish by 3 o'clock. He walked up to Wei Jin, showed the class with his finger, and said that he was suitable for this role. The guy seemed surprised. The young man became embarrassed. He put his hands behind his head, not understanding what was happening because he was not alone here. 7 hours later, Widgeon was helping another young man work through the sketches. A few minutes later, the same person was wondering where this guy had come from. The man praised our hero, placing his hand on his shoulder. The person who works best should be in charge. Widgeon is surprised by such words and thanks the man, following him with his gaze. After this project, the same man invited him to work on their team. Widgeon smiled and agreed, turning around to see the man off. The beautiful, newly built building attracted attention with its brilliance. The guy held a piece of paper in his hands and looked at it with an attentive gaze. He was pleased with himself, met a man who would be the head of a well-known company, and even received the number of another good person. Construction requires people. Every person is dear and important to him. While the hero was immersed in his thoughts, Peter called out to him. The guy turned around and stared at him. He invited the guy to work with them some more. But the carpentry work was finished. So what do they want from him? Peter touched him and began to persuade him to go to another facility where he would be the leader. But Viggen refused. Peter was sincerely surprised. He opened his mouth and screamed. He didn't understand the refusal. The guy handed the phone screen to him. Peter began to look at it. Throwing up his hands, the boss didn't understand how he could get work experience if he was a student. He remembered words from a past life about college, and the fact that he was still at a construction site. The humiliation of that day was remembered by the character. He clenched his fists and looked at the sky. A red bus was moving along the road. People were sitting on this bus. There were people on the bus. All the seats were occupied. Among these people was Viggen, who was sitting with a backpack in his hands and looking out the window. Everyone was in a good mood. They wanted to come quickly and live on campus away from their parents. Looking at his reflection in the glass, the guy knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted a diploma. But at the same time, Viggen needs to be sociable. There is no other way. This makes him droop. The guy looked at his phone. He needs to wait a little longer, and then he will buy himself a good one. Looking around the inside of the bus, he saw that people were sleeping there. It was quiet. Leaning back in his seat, he closed his eyes and decided to follow the example of the others and sleep. He held the phone in his hand, began to fall asleep, tightly squeezed the hand with the phone, but the hand with the phone slipped down. The phone slid down and rolled forward. Viggen followed it, apologizing to the people. The girl sitting in front without turning her head, raised her hand with the phone, handing it to the guy. Taking the phone, he was surprised by the girl's behavior and looked at the outstretched phone. The girl sitting next to him exclaimed in delight when she saw the iPhone. Helga. She smiled at him. Handing her the phone, Vigen thought she was friendly, smiling. The girl extended her hand. Returning the phone to him, she replied that it was cool. The guy looked skeptically at the thing in his hands. Helga and another girl were talking to each other about the scholarship competition. Vigen heard the girls' conversation out of the corner of his ear, turned in their direction, and became interested. He took out a pack of cookies and turned to them, offering them cookies with a smile. Helga was delighted with the tasty treat, accepted it, and laughed. Her laughter was ringing, but the guy didn't give up so easily. He directed the conversation in the direction he wanted and asked to tell him about the scholarship. But the girl narrowed her eyes. She didn't fall for his trick. Certainly not for the treats. A bottle of drink and a cookie passed from the young man to the girl. Helga was chewing. She had a satisfied face. There was a jar in the duck. Vigen sat sighing, folding his arms on his chest. The guy listened carefully to her story. After she stopped chewing, he realized that he needed to get to the newcomers' meeting. Looking out the window, he smiled, and outside the window, there were mountains and trees. There was snow. Here he is, skiing down the mountain, deftly maneuvering, using poles for balance. The frosty, fresh air intoxicated him. Vigen stopped and took off his mask from his eyes. Helga pulled him out of his dreams. There are no such subjects on the schedule. He got angry with her. He couldn't dream. But she laughed and realized that they were classmates and had become friends on the bus. We got off the bus while roll call was taking place, and the guy saw a girl who picked up his phone. The girl had long hair. She looked with sad eyes at the people around her. Vigen thought about thanking her, but Helga had already run up to her and started a conversation. He looked at the girls and realized that she was a good friend, and to say she was introverted meant lying. A couple of people gathered and sat waiting, training first-year students at the Faculty of Architecture. Vigen was there. He sat and listened attentively, and Helga sat down next to him. She clung to him and tried to find out why he applied to this particular faculty. The guy looked away. The girl did not back down. She knew that he was in the army and older than her. She laughed and decided to call him Grandpa. She laughed. The girl understood from her eyes that he was angry, although she knew only one person who was angry because of his grandfather. After the seating announcement was announced, Vigen looked down the rows and saw a guy with glasses. Looking around, he saw the girl from the bus, but Helga demanded his attention. She scolded the young man because he came to study, not to look for girls. Turning to the girl, the guy was angry. He warned her to stop behaving like that. There was a photo of two guys on the phone. If the girl doesn't stop behaving like this, she'll cancel the blind date. She screamed, asked for forgiveness, clenched her fist. But the guy told her to look at herself. Their squabble was interrupted by a voice from the podium, greeting the freshman. Raising his head, he recognized this man and could not take his eyes off him. It was a guy with glasses with a microphone, Kane Prawn, the student council president, praising the new set of freshmen. Vigen clenched his fist. He couldn't believe his eyes. This couldn't be happening. He pursed his lips, narrowed his eyes, all tense. He was angry. He realized that he also went to this university. People around him began to whisper. They heard about how nice he was, how good the president was from a wealthy family. He clenched his fist and hit his knee with all his strength. He thought about whether to strike first and whether it was worth it. The girl expressed her thoughts that guys are gentlemen on the outside, but treacherous on the inside. The young man looked at her. Vigen raised his hand and showed his finger up, expressing his agreement with her. In response, Helga winked and stuck out the tip of her tongue. She liked this guy. She quickly switched gears, beamed, and asked him about a date next week. He shouted back that only in a month, since the guy I knew had not finished his service yet. Helga raised her hands to her cheeks. She imagined him and told Vigen. He realized that she quickly fell in love. On stage, Kane continued to talk and show projects, extending his hand in the right direction. The two of them realized that this was exactly the project and the event for the scholarship. They leaned forward. Professor of Space Design Chuck Vorgak was already on stage. The young man recognized him too. This man was also in his past life. Chuck Vorgak. He is now the youngest professor in the space design department. But then in 20 years, he will be a very important person. This man was talking about the night. Vigen watched. Listen to him. On this night, one thing needs to be done. Draw a line on paper. Training for students is important, including for designers. But with training your color fades, said the man. A long speech which everyone was imbued with. Competition fuels interest. Scholarship is important. But this should not be your ultimate goal. He ended his monologue. The hero's eyes shone. He finally realized that he had come to study design. Vigen walked with a backpack on his shoulders with the rest of the people. He was lost in his thoughts about the design. He was distracted by a guy who was inquiring about name tags and a story about how they would live in a room of 4 people. Entering the room, he saw Helga and the girl from the bus and an unfamiliar guy. The guy was wearing glasses. He turned to Vigen and gave him a slight smile. Helga ran up to him. She was glad to see him. She was all beaming. They were in the same group. The young man's gaze tore away from the girl, and he noticed something and looked. He saw all sorts of things on the table. Scissors, glue, various measuring instruments. Seeing this, Helga and Vigen opened their mouths. It looks like a store. The guy with glasses attracted everyone's attention and started talking about the room and its occupants. The guy continued by saying that he invited them all to meet. He himself is Ron Beeman. The girl closed her eyes, folded her arms over her chest, and replied that she was the oldest here, 21 years old, and she was Sonia Merple. Vigen's turn came. He introduced himself, with instructions to be on friendly terms with him. Sonia exclaimed. She thought she would be the eldest and leaned forward. All 4 of them settled down in the room. The girls sat on the sofa, the guys below on the carpet. They were amazed at fate when everyone sat next to each other. Sonia laughed. She thought that Helga and Vigen were dating. The guy began to perspire. The girl raised her hands to her cheeks and screamed how she could date her grandfather. Vigen began to calm down the furious Helga. But she did not stop talking about how old he was. They continued to bicker. The others looked at them and thought they were funny. Ron felt sad. He thought that everyone had friends except him looking at these 2. Sonia turned to Beeman. He received an increased scholarship and his grades were good. The guy laughed. He referred to a little luck and hard work. Vigen stared at the design night brochure. He peered at every sheet. Ron and Helga also buried their heads in the piece of paper. She was indignant at the requirements. They made the frames very large. But Vigen smiled. He knew what needed to be done, so he gathered everyone around him. They all read the conditions and imagined what they needed. Sonia raised her hand to her lips. They all have different tastes. But how can they combine everything? Vigen put his hand on the sheet and called everyone to gather around. He knew what to do. They began to listen to him. They don't have much time. They won't sleep at night. The guy pointed to his watch. They began to set up situations. The young man thought about how to fit 3 in such a small area. But it dawned on Vigen. He called everyone. They don't have much time, and they need to decide now. Ron began to resent the fact that they weren't dating now. He didn't understand it. He wanted to be offended, but he heard that Vigen was making models, and he became interested in it. With a smile, he offered his help and would supervise them. They agreed. Ron lowered his head, completely drooping. He is the best student. Why doesn't anyone listen to him? He remembered the day when he found out about his admission to the university. He was so happy. He did it. But now he was sad. He was covered in sweat. His eyes were still downcast. They made calculations, calculated the floor and ceiling. It was very difficult. But Sonia thought and said honestly, he thinks that this will not be enough. Resting her chin on her hand, Vigen raised his hand to his face, agreeing with her. There are too many floors for a family, and you can't install an elevator. Then the guy asked Ron's opinion. He was confused and could not answer quickly, having controlled himself. He quickly came up with an idea: we need to make pilots, put 3 floors, and make the first floor a garage. If they make a space created by separating the building from the ground using posts or columns, then they will fulfill one of the client's requirements. Everyone liked his idea. Everyone began to praise Ron. He became embarrassed. The 4 of them bent over a white sheet of paper, all drawing their opinions. Ron exhaled without taking his eyes off the plan. He proposed making a terrace. Wygen looked at the guy for quite a long time. He was confused and decided if he didn't like it, then there wouldn't be a terrace. But he smiled, showed his thumb. He liked everything. And this idea became a reality. Ron studied the map. There was a river there, so the terrace would be there. Sonia admired him. Wygen presented the picture and agreed that this option would be the best. Turning to the girls, he gave them smiles. At this rate, they will receive a scholarship. Raising his hand, Ron had already paid his full tuition. He didn't need a scholarship. The hero looked at the bickering between the girls and Ron and grinned. He liked the atmosphere. Becoming serious, the character rolled out a sheet of paper to work on. They didn't have much time anyway. Everyone turned in his direction, opened their mouths. They were surprised at such pressure. Viggen worked hard, without distraction. He drew, measured, and sketched. But what he saw shocked him. He did not understand how this could be. After drawing a pencil on the sheet, the place became golden. Having drawn a complete plan of the house, it appeared golden in color, voluminous, beautiful. I was amazed by Vygen, a gold print that was seen by the best designers. The guy, lost in his thoughts, muttered about making a good floor plan. Sonia looked at him for a long time. Without looking up from the drawing, the girl's thin hand lay on his hand, showing the direction. The light touch of her hand caused a trembling in his body. Viggen emerged from his thoughts. He looked up at Sonia. She looked at him worriedly. Helga intervened. She looked at her hands and narrowed her eyes and asked about the time. The young man thought about how to distribute responsibilities and rested his chin on his fist. He pointed his finger at Ron. The order came for the 3rd floor plan. The young man happily accepted it. The girls need to think through the design of the 1st floor. They turned to him and smiled. Viggen looked at the plan in his hands. The ladder would need to be installed correctly, but it would still need to be double-checked. Sonia looked at him intently. She felt his experience in this matter. When the guy caught her eye, she turned away abruptly and became embarrassed. Viggen sat down on a chair and began to draw. He was thinking whether to draw along the golden line or not. He looked down and couldn't believe it. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. While he was drawing everything along the golden lines, he did not notice how he had drawn not only the 1st floor, but also the entire plan of the house. He looked at his drawing. The waste of time was eliminated. Everything was included, both the kitchen and the pilots. Taking a break from the plan, he looked around at the people. Helga screamed. The guy's reaction was strange to her. He thought things weren't going well for them, so he stared ahead. Now is not the time to get lost. It is necessary that everyone's efforts are not in vain. Vygen offered to talk. They stared at him incomprehensibly. He suggested to Ron that he move the stairs slightly to the left. He opened his mouth. But in his head, he had already imagined how to do it. Sonia turned to Viggen. She didn't know what to do with the living room, which they decided to leave. The girl smiled and suggested making all the walls out of glass, watched and waited for an answer. I liked the girl's answer. The guy caught his flair for design and showed him this option with a gold print. The idea was good, so they clapped their hands together and came to a consensus. The hero clenched his fist. He must hurry. Ideas are meaningless if they are not implemented. The work was in full swing. The guy sat and showed Sonia how and what was needed. Time passed. It was already late. They glued Drew. Ron and Helga could not stand it and fell asleep while the hero sat and thought. Sonia entered the room. A towel was around her neck. Everyone was sleeping. She saw it. But she also saw another man who was not sleeping. She sweated and looked at him. She saw that the guy was looking at the sheet thoughtfully, carefully studying something. She sat down next to him, asked him to go rest. She could wake him up later. but the character refused. He was immersed in work. The girl smiles, straightens a strand of hair, tucks it behind her ear, and talks about winning together. There is a knock on the door. The girl asks to hand in her work. He expects that the finished material will now be brought out to her. Vigen opens the door, hands something to the girl. Her eyes widen. She is very surprised by the work and does not understand what it is. A question arises in her eyes. Then she exhales that it's a good job. The hero's smile becomes wide. Afterwards, they sat with Sonia, pressed against the brick wall, and talked, the bruises under their eyes indicating fatigue. Lowering her head, the girl replied that she wanted to sleep. The guy looked at her and smiled. Handing her a blanket, Vigen sends her to bed. She looks at the blanket, and a light smile touches her lips. The three stood and thought. They wondered if the work had been stolen from the modeling agency, and whether it was possible to build such a house right now. We looked at the work. This is not a building level, but this house is good, transparent glass, 3 floors. One of the trio, a man, found out that this is a real house, and then the area is being considered. The second man considered this luck, since even the best third-year student is not capable of this. This year's fellows seem to have already been selected. This work not only includes construction, but also design. Everything is thought out perfectly. This year will be interesting. The scholarship recipients slept in their room, some how and where, some on the sofa, some on the floor, and some on each other's shoulders. People in a cafe eat, drink, and laugh. Eat chicken hot, breaded. It is the main dish in this cafe. Our foursome also entered this cafe. They were attracted by the delicious smell, and they stopped tired. The guys were surprised that so many freshmen came. They were upset that this didn't happen in their time. The tired girls leaned against each other. They wanted to stay at home, but the student council president did not allow them to do so. A guy stood up with a bottle of beer. He introduced himself and asked if they knew the reason for the gathering. The people who were here shouted, raised their fists in the air, meeting face to face. His face changed and darkened when he heard a voice that said that he didn't like this. But then he joked, "This guy can't be that serious." Everyone laughed, appreciating his humor. Only the 4 at the table were not involved. The girls broke out in a sweat and almost vomited when he pretended to be cute. Vigen offered to just drink and raised a large glass of beer to his lips. But when he heard his name and that he was the oldest on the course, he spat out his beer. Helga looked at Vigen's state, and she realized that he was angry. The guy laughed, approached the hero, asked about his readiness for the talent show, announcing that he had served in the army. His acquaintances began to whisper. They asked whether he was ready to perform. This presenter was interrogating Vigen. He wanted to know what would happen. A dance, a song, or mimicry. Gritting his teeth, the guy didn't want the hero to ruin everyone's mood. After thinking for a moment, Vigen exclaimed that he wanted bomb shots. Everyone was surprised. The girls opened their mouths so much they stared at them, not understanding. He will make shots for each table, our character said, while opening the first bottle of beer. Everyone was very discouraged by such a statement indeed. Meanwhile, beer was pouring into glasses. Briskly and deftly, he poured beer into glasses. But before that, he shook the bottle, causing a volcano in it. He raised his hand to his glasses. The guy couldn't believe his eyes what he just saw. Vigen handed the girls a drink, assuring them that it was very tasty. Just after tasting the drink, her cheeks lit up. It was incredibly delicious. The girl drank a glass and climbed onto the table to dance. The guy with glasses was surprised. She's not like that. He held out a glass and demanded to tell about himself. He smiled, but the smile was not particularly inviting. Looking back at him, Vigen grinned and said to wait a little. He too was no exception and drank a shot. After which, he was pleasantly surprised by this drink. His roommates exhaled, each having their own thoughts, but they were all delighted with the guy. Sonia did not take her eyes off Vigen, lightly resting her cheek on her hand, and had a faint smile on her lips. Ron looked at the two and seemed to understand something, but without fully realizing it. The young man looked at the phone. The girl returned home, but something happened. The girl with her hair tied up looked at the phone. She didn't dare answer. Clutching the phone tightly in his hands, Vijin peered at it. He had made a mistake somewhere since there was no answer from her yet. I opened the group chat and started reading. Everyone praised him, offered friendship. He was popular. The guy closed his eyes, squeezed the phone. He scolded himself for panicking because the girl was young. You can understand her. The young man heard the notification day end, which means it's already today. He looked down through the window and saw the roofs of houses through it, he thought. Vegan came to the right place. At that time, buying an apartment was a dream. But due to the high interest rate, they could not afford it. He approached. The girl was sitting at the table and minding her own business, not paying attention to him. The guy approached, smiling. He was here for a consultation. The girl screamed, scared. Looking at him, she thought that he was too young. Putting on a smile, she asked about the sale of the apartment. With his hands folded across his chest, the guy asked for another story from her. She was confused and began flipping through the papers. She held out her hand with the magazine, ready to show him the floor plan. He began to carefully study the magazine, becoming serious. Without taking his eyes off the study, the girl's smile never left her lips. She had already mentally sold something, even despite his age. After the words about buying an apartment, not one, but two, the girl stared at him, not believing it. He is even ready to pay the initial payment. Fixed, the hero smiled. Confirming his words, the girl voiced the second amount. She kept a smile. Having clarified a couple of details for himself, Vijin asked questions with a bored face. Hearing that everything was true, he wanted to know about a different type of apartment. The girl was shaking. She couldn't believe it. The girl screamed. She thought that there was a major in front of her, so she could get up quickly. There will be no separate registration tax for the right of pre-sale, the guy learned with a smile. Having carefully studied the documents, double-checking everything and reading every word. In the guy's head, calculations of purchase and sale were made, and he was initially happy. With clenched lips, hands tucked under the table, she looked at the document and did not believe that he was young. The guy looked at the seller with an innocent look, clean and open. He didn't have any money on his account at all, but she didn't need to know about that. The girl stood up, bowed her head down, thanked him. He looked at her with his mouth open. The guy came out and stretched. Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the cancellation of pre-sales will be announced. Due to the fact that the place is new, compensation will be paid. The grandees will grow. The young man was pleased with himself, looking to the side with a smile. He thought what he had planned next there. I entered some building, an empty room with a window in the wall and a door, motion sensors at the top. Vijin came in not alone, but with a woman who told him about this building. The guy thought about the premises. It would be perfect for an office. The woman persuaded him that there would be no better offer like hers anywhere. Turning to her, he decided to purchase this premises and would wait for an SMS. Once again immersed in his thoughts, Vijin decided to think about business, found office space. All that remained was to find a colleague. I met my friend Kinu Sorg, invited him to a cafe, watched him eat, muttering offendedly why he only came now. Vijin looked at the guy. 10 years have passed, and he is still the same. He still loves to eat a lot. Keanu smiled, took a sip from a bottle of juice. He was happy and full. Leaning towards Vijin, he asked why the others weren't there. He wanted to play billiards or some other game. He looked directly, without a hint of a smile. He needed to talk to him first. Keanu looked up from the bottle and looked at him with a frightened look. A smile appeared on his lips. Then words followed about becoming his partner, starting to do business with him. Unable to resist, the guy spat out the juice from the unexpected proposal. Vijin managed to move his head away, but Keanu's reaction was strange. He started screaming, squeezed the juice bottle with his hand. His mouth was distorted in a scream. He didn't want to get into anything. It's a pyramid. He advised not to linger there either. Vijin began to sweat, raised his hand to his head, closed his eyes. He did not understand the reaction of the person sitting opposite him. He could not find his colleague. 2 little boys were lying on the floor and drawing on sheets of paper. One was wearing glasses. It was Vegan. He was 12 years old, and even then he was fond of drawings. The boy with the glasses was Keanu Sorg. He was also drawing on a large sheet of paper. Here is a boy assembling a robot, concentrating on connecting the parts. All that remains is the head. And Keanu painted the same robot with a brush, also doing his job without distraction. Mom also scolded the two of them for not doing their homework, and for having fun with toys for a long time. The guys defended themselves together, saying that it was Sunday and there was no homework. When Mom left, she still gave them instructions to go to bed early. They had been friends for a very long time, shaking hands with each other, cementing their friendship. Vijin tried to talk about his idea. There was no bring a friend here, everything was clean here. But Keanu was still suspicious of this venture, which business does not have risks. But the guy calmly began to tell him that they have something that they like. Keanu smiled, his cheeks turning red. He shouted out a word that they both liked. Vigin jumped up, swung his fist at the table. The guy ducked his head. The hero asked him to think, called him names. Keanu cried, lowered his head. He was dressed in a suit. His hands were down. Who taught him such things? He gave up his dream because of the pressure of his parents. He turned away, buried himself in the sleeve of his suit and sobbed. Now a confident young man sat in front of Vijin, looking at the guy with narrowed eyes. Then I asked him about my desire to open my own design studio. Although he gave up the dream, he still grabbed onto it, which is why our hero chose him as a partner. Vijin extended his hand across the table. He smiled because Keanu correctly interpreted his words. Squinting one eye, he knew he wanted to hire the design guys. In response, also squinting his eye, raising the glass, the hero decided that they would work for them. While eating, he clarified with Keanu that they would do all the work, and that's it. He nodded and confirmed this. Having sharply looked at him intently, the character was almost there. The officer promised to give him a job, but Keanu laughed. He didn't know what they could do for an architectural bureau. Vijin could not stand it at this. He shouted loudly that they would create models. Keanu didn't understand. He looked at his friend in confusion and fear. One word from the model was beating in his head. The hero assured him, asserted that there was a demand for architectural models, and they were good at this business. He was shocked. They can make a lot of money just from their hobby. But Vijin said something that gave Keanu goosebumps, earning this amount for one. This job will be after school. He clenched his fist and agreed, smiling. He had nothing to lose, he would try. They clinked their glasses, as was expected of his friend. Vijin remembered that if not for this day, he would not have seen Keanu next year, and he did everything right. Farther from his dream, Keanu became depressed and committed suicide by jumping off a bridge. A girl with long hair stood and peered into the distance. She was expecting someone. She raised her hand to her head, which was spinning and closing her eyes. She thought that she had drunk a lot. A guy approached her, learning what she was doing here. The girl opened her eyes. She called him senior, but he didn't like it that way. He invited her to call himself a guy, but the girl refused. The young man dumbfounded her, saying that if she wants to get a scholarship, then she needs her affection for him. He looked at her. The girl looked at him. She didn't know what to do. A drop of sweat rolled down her cheek. He bent close to her and asked in her ear about the guy, to which the girl replied that she didn't have time and didn't have a boyfriend. Without noticing anyone, the guy watched the girl. He doesn't like it when she's sad. Unexpectedly, the young man was touched with ice cream. He jumped up and screamed because he felt cold. Vijin handed out the ice cream. He walked by, breathed fresh air, and saw them. The headman screamed, his mouth twisted in anger, and refused the sweets. And Sonia agreed, but Vigin didn't know which one he liked, so he bought a lot and gave her the package. Kira smiled. They had already called him. He had completely changed, and was now leaving radiating good nature. The elder was leaving, passing Vigin. Tension was felt between them. He bared his teeth, stopped in front of the hero, and said that he would watch him. But Vigin smiled broadly, thanked Cyrus, and hoped that he would help him. Sonia turned to the guy. She thanked him sincerely. She didn't like the fact that she was attracting interest from the headman. He asked her to go for a walk, and she agreed, Ron watching them. He listened to their conversation. looked with sad eyes and an open mouth. He clutched the jar of drink tightly in his hand. Anger and resentment consumed him. This jar flew into the trash can. He threw it out with force, as if this jar was to blame for all the troubles. Weijin invited her to join him to register for the course, something he had never done before. She agreed, and they walked together, leaning against each other. A feeling of love began to flare up between them. The phone lay next to him on the pillow. It vibrated, but Weijin did not hear it. He was fast asleep with his mouth open. The hero picked up the phone, raised it to his ear, and answered. A girl's cheerful voice was heard at the other end. The girl's voice suggested meeting, but the guy had other plans, and it didn't work out now. It was Sonia. She said that all the courses recommended by high school students were filled. Weijin's face changed. Courses for basic subjects are filled out automatically, but the girl was angry. Everything went wrong because of him. He laughed. The guy began to say that she could have applied without him. She would have signed up alone. The hero looked at the phone. Sonia hung up without finishing the conversation. He doubted his words because apparently he said something wrong. Adjusting the cuffs on his hands, he thought that after studying, he would not get a job. Weijin was riding on the bus. He was wondering how to make peace with Sonia. Her voice was angry. The guy in the room was carrying boxes with things. Keanu ran in. He was glad that he was here. The guy came early, clenching his fist and smiling. Today is the first day of opening their office. The first office, Weijin grinned. This would only be the beginning of their new life. He agreed with Kainu, but first they had to sort everything out because they had boxes in the room. By arranging things in boxes, the workers learned where and what to put. The guys were sitting having a snack, but even during it, they were talking about work. Weijin looked up from his food. They will soon have a 3D printer. They need all this for work. Keanu, without chewing, exclaimed in surprise with his mouth full of food. He didn't think it was even possible to take a printer. The hero laughed, hurrying his colleague, who gobbled up the noodles very quickly, deftly wielding his chopsticks. A few days later, everything was ready. The office was ready. The equipment was shiny and pleasing to the eye. White tables on which stood only what was needed for work. Chairs. Everything was new. Weijin leaned against the wall, looked around his place, was happy. Everything looked good. The organization was finished earlier, so there will be time for lunch. He heard voices, turned to see who it was. It was his friends, Helga, Ron, and Sonia. Seeing Sonia, he was very surprised. He tried to look at her, but she was hiding behind these two. This was not Sonia, he was confused. The other girl, embarrassed, straightened her hair. Climbing the stairs, he was already in class. It was a break. The guy walked confidently. Hand on canvas, hand drawing. All this is very pleasant, good memories. Helga secretly whispered to the guy that the third-year student would have to attend him again. The guys were horrified. Studying the same thing for the third time is not interesting. With his hand under his chin, Weijin thought that everything was different when retaking the course. Then they saw Sonia and began to tease her in a friendly manner, saying that she was a philosopher because she wanted to study philosophy. After she asked them to shut up, Weijin felt awkward. Sonia clenched her teeth. She wanted to be alone. Ron began to apologize. She exhaled, closed her eyes. She didn't understand why they were making fun of her. The teacher, Pete Mikkel, came in. He was in charge of the basic systems course. He laughed. Last year, there were only 2 retakes, so he will try. Sonia rested her chin on her hand, lowered her head. She was ready to work. Ron looked at Pete with admiration, his eyes sparkling with approaching tears. The Jinn was sleeping with his head propped up on his hand, drool dripping from the corner of his mouth. The teacher began to ask his questions. They were standard, and wanted to hear the answer to them. Ron answered Pete's question, was pleased with himself, and raised his hand to his glasses. The teacher's eyes lit up. He leaned forward and found a smart man. Closing his eyes, he smiled and invited me to come to his office after class. Weijin happily slept through the first lesson on basic systems. He folded his hands on the table and lowered his head. Everyone dispersed. The audience vacated. Someone else remained, collecting their things. A neat little hand poked a finger into the elbow of the lying man. Vigin raised his head from his elbow, waking up, his drool still hanging from his mouth. The girls stood in front of him. They folded their arms on their chests, worried about him, that the professor would take him off. Rubbing his eyes, the guy thanked him for waking him up, but he was wondering where Ron was. Helga replied that the professor called him into the office, so he left early. Stretching and yawning sweetly, the hero understood everything. The girls were not happy with his behavior. They talked to each other while Vigin came to his senses, discussing the course. He looked to the side, rested his chin on his hand. He thought strangely that with 10 years of experience, he did not have basic systems. The girls were interested in his schedule, but he was not enrolled in humanities courses. Helga laughed at this, said that it was cool. The guy became embarrassed and looked away. Woojin replied that everything was fine, and he still had time to sign up. Sonia was skeptical about his speech. There would be no places, but the guy teased her. Then he would sign up for philosophy. Helga laughed. She waved to them and said goodbye, saying that they would see each other tomorrow. Going outside, Vigin caught up with Sonia, asking if she had lessons today, but she was free. Turning to him, the girl was wondering where he was. He had a meeting. He was going there. She raised her head up. Looking there, she was sorry, but she understood. The hero found a way out. They are on their way home. They just need to go together. The senior students invited her to dinner. She should go there, the girl answered regretfully. He looked at her. There must be a lot of people there. She closed her eyes. Their eye contact and conversation were interrupted by the green bus that Vigin needed. The guy saw his bus. He was surprised that it had already arrived. He had to go. Sonia looked at him. Running up to the bus, he hurried to get inside while the doors were still open. The girl followed the guy with a sad look. She sighed after him. The signs were flashing. The street was clean. People weren't walking, and the advertisements on the buildings attracted attention. Wiggin was at the meeting, concentrated, and with his whole appearance he inspired confidence. The one he was meeting with was an older man with a small mustache, brought a glass of water and took a sip. The building was large, many doors, windows. Even if it was not for him, the manager would have made a schedule. By pointing a finger at the shadow, problems with the top could not be avoided. The man sat at the table, smiled, and as a result, thanks to the guy, he received a promotion a year earlier. Vigin put sushi in his mouth and began to chew blissfully. He liked this restaurant. The man began to be interested in student life, but the guy answered dryly, "He talks like an old man." The hero wanted to order an expensive dish. The man smiled. He would order a special dish for his magic wand. Having become serious, the man spoke. He thought that the guy would refuse him, because last time that's what happened. But Vigin smiled. He fulfilled his promise to contact him soon. It was his former boss. The young man called him to congratulate him on the completion of construction. But this was not only a reason to call the man. He tensed, waiting for what the hero would tell him. But the guy took the role. He was in no hurry to say the reason for the call, because you can enjoy your food. But the man was already starting to get angry, clutching the glass tighter. Vigin smiled. He ate and kept the smile while the boss was angry. The man was surprised at his calmness and self-confidence, as if the experience was great. Having stopped chewing, the hero finally decided to speak. He was here to discuss work. The boss leaned forward. He was a little dumbfounded because last time he refused to work. But the guy looked expectantly. He was not talking about work. There was silence. Wiping your mouth with a napkin, taking your time, doing everything measuredly and slowly. He leaned forward a little, and the guy whispered to Chung Woo, who opened the model house. The man was surprised, opened his mouth, and knitted his eyebrows. He did not understand how he knew all this. Wijin continued. The one who opened the contract won the contract by a small margin. The man was at a loss, trying to remember when he was told about the project. The hero looked out the window. Another company received the same contract. When the character focused on this, he thought that then the house would be pushed back. The boss understood that the guy's reasoning was logical. This could happen in this industry. Wu Jin saw that he had hit the target, and the thoughts of the person sitting opposite were the same. But the man suddenly demanded honesty from the guy. He looked scary. The hero was confused. Did not understand what he wanted to know. He had nothing more to say. He leaned forward. The boss wanted to know about the young man's age. He laughed, probably because of the way he eats. Raising the glass, he drank all the water, closed his eyes to continue the conversation, and rested a little. In any case, this is why it is necessary to set a starting point. Eyebrows brought together, the man wanted to know. The guy wants to make a model for an architectural house. The guy did not hide his intentions. He answered honestly that everything was true. That's how it was intended. Transferring the model will not be difficult. This is not a problem, which is why you need to transfer the work to a professional. Once they win the contract, they will create models to sell the apartments. The man looked, and in a stern voice asked if he was confident in his abilities. The question that the boss asked is different from labor. It's not just hiring a carpenter. Taking a glass and starting to drink, closing his eyes, he clarified a couple of nuances about the business license and portfolio. Of course he had a license, but his portfolio was still in progress. He finished. The boss got blown up. He definitely needs it.